Welcome. This is the September 23rd LaRouchePAC Saturday night class. I'll be your host tonight, Mike Steger. And tonight we have a discussion by Bob Ingraham. Many of you know Bob. He's spoken on these many times. Bob has also published a book on Lincoln, and we did a series of podcasts about 2 years ago, or a little over 2 years ago, on the question of Lincoln. So I will post Bob's book in the chat for people to see. And he also published an article just this last week on the question of a Republican Labor Party, which, if you haven't been paying attention, Trump is building. And now with the UAW strike in full force, or at least growing into full force, the questions of a new kind of Republican Party of the working class has never been more important. It's never been more critical to shifting the political balance back to the hands of the American people. And the role of Lincoln in accomplishing a similar task in his time is of critical relevance today. So on that note, Bob, I'll just bring you in and let you take it away.
Okay. Well, hi, folks. Frankly, I didn't expect to be back here this soon. I gave the presentation, as some might know, last Saturday on the question of foundations and nonprofits, which I will say is related in really a pretty direct way to what we're going to be discussing tonight. The title of this presentation that was given to it in the email that was sent out is Donald Trump, MAGA, and the Lincoln Revolution. And as Mike said, this is based on an article that I posted a few days ago on the LaRouchePAC website, which is available, called Creating a Republican Labor Party. Now, what really sort of provoked both the article and now this discussion here tonight was the, most directly, the UAW strike, the auto strike, which began 8 days ago when the UAW struck 3 plants, in the Midwest. As some might know, yesterday, just within the last 24 hours, that strike expanded, and it now, I think, includes, I have it written down here somewhere. Yeah, it has 38 plants have now been struck in a total of 20 states, ranging all the way from, Virginia to California, all across the country. So that's sort of what provoked this discussion. And one thing I do want to do before I forget is that as we get to the discussion period at the end of my remarks, I think it would be very useful if someone from our Michigan organization, whoever that might be, gives a short report on some of the organizing that we're doing there, because we have been going out to the UAW picket lines. We have been organizing up a storm throughout Michigan and elsewhere. And the responses we're getting and the discussions we're having are really quite interesting and quite important, as sort of a indicator of the political climate that we're in at this moment. So I hope someone is prepared to give brief remarks on that when I'm done. Now, look, there's 2 ways to think about this, or maybe there's more than 2 ways, but the 2 ways that I'm going to focus on is that, you could look at it from the standpoint of practical politics, and there's a lot of chatter about this now on the internet. I'm sure everyone has seen it. It's reported in newspapers and magazines, which is that that Trump is making, in terms of his 2024 campaign, that he is making significant inroads into getting support, growing support from what you might call traditional Democratic Party constituencies. And that would include union members, also, African Americans, Hispanics, and others, people that the Democratic Party has sort of considered their own, that, a growing number of these are now swinging over to support Trump. And, this has certain political pundits, Republican Party pundits, sort of salivating at the mouth of, look at this is great, they're looking at it from the standpoint of practical politics of, winning the 2024 election. Now, there's an importance to that, but it is dwarfed by really the second way of looking at what's going on, because I said there were two ways to look at what's going on, which is the question of building a new political majority in this country, not based on combinations of constituencies, this chunk of votes, that chunk of votes, but building a new political majority, a new political movement based on principle, based on certain principles as to what the American Republic is, what it is meant to be, and what is necessary if we're going to rescue our nation, if we're going to rebuild it, and if we're going to do what is necessary for it to progress into the future. And what I would argue is that is precisely what we are seeing. It's not simply a shifting of constituents from one side to the other, that we are within already a political revolution, which has a long way to go, but which is very much underway as to rescuing our republic and returning it to the mission that it was originally intended to accomplish. Now, what I would, ask people to think about is that the creation of this type of movement poses challenges, both to the way that, certain, working class voters within both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, think about things, think about what is important to them, because on the Democratic side, you've got the trade unionists, the blacks, and others who have, for a long time been loyal to the Democratic Party. And on the Republican side, you have, say, I don't want to give it a label, but you have sort of traditional conservative Republican voters. And what I would argue to people tonight is that both of these constituencies in the Republican Party and the Democratic Party are now faced with a challenge, because they're going to have to rethink, their actual political philosophy, their actual notions of what an American policy really is. And in that regard, I will mention for the last time, I won't bring it up again, the discussion last Saturday on foundations and nonprofits, because what we were discussing in that, last Saturday, was the question of oligarchical rule, the rule by, an oligarchy, what Douglas MacArthur, Douglas Magruder, Douglas McGregor, forgive me, folks, what Douglas McGregor is increasingly calling, in his own way, the ruling class, which has dominated both political parties and which has put a straitjacket within both political parties as to what is allowed to be discussed, what is allowed to be considered as policy. And this is what we have to break out of. And it's not like we're starting from scratch, because we've already made, significant progress in this. And Trump, through his Agenda 47, through Truth Social, through the speeches that he's giving now in various locations, is pushing this process forward, this process of transformation. So, look, as people know, for the trade union movement, because we are, I am going to begin with some discussion of the UAW strike, the trade union movement, and essentially, what you could call the working class in general, has been really loyal, more or less, to the Democratic Party. And certainly the trade union bureaucracy has become an arm of the Democratic Party, going back to 1933, to the inauguration of Franklin Roosevelt. And, that has lasted for many, many decades. For that reason, you get some of these conservative Republicans who consider trade unions to be the enemy. They are the enemy, which is a very foolish way of looking at it. Roosevelt built his coalition. He did a lot of things which helped working people. He got enthusiastic support from the trade unions for a lot of the steps that he took. And, the loyalty he got was, well-deserved by and large, whatever you want to say about it. It's certainly the case that the Republican Party of that period, the Republican Party of, Thomas Dewey and Robert Taft and these people were no friends of, the unions or working class people in the United States. So this lasted for a long time. But what we are seeing now, both with trade unions and, with Black voters, with Hispanic voters, is that this whole Democratic Party coalition, or, if you want to be more blunt about it, this Democratic Party plantation is crumbling, and it's crumbling very rapidly, because what you have is a situation where, working people, union or otherwise, are being destroyed, being absolutely devastated by the economic policies that have particularly flowed since the 2007, 2008 financial crisis. It didn't begin then, but particularly since then. Real wages are dropping. I mean, I don't have to go through the litany of it in terms of what is occurring at this point. Bear in mind that traditionally trade union members, particularly the upper echelon of trade union members, auto workers, steel workers, the building trades, construction workers, many of these unions, have been a critical component, of what is called the American middle class during the last 50 years. The wages paid, the wages which were earned by the millions upon millions of union members allowed for them to raise families, to buy homes, to live have a decent life, to provide for their children, to pay for their children's education. This is the American middle class. And, back in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, This was not, restricted to, white collar professionals, bankers, and what have you, people working in, like in New York City and Wall Street or in Madison Avenue. But the heart and soul of the middle class was the blue collar union family, who were able to afford, where family formation was possible because of the wage levels, the healthcare levels, and what have you. And this is all now being destroyed. And the Democratic Party today, as is increasingly recognized by many of these constituencies, bears no resemblance in any way, shape, or form to the Democratic Party of Franklin Roosevelt. The party of Franklin Roosevelt is dead. Now, it is true there are still a lot of good people in the Democratic Party, and even some who are fighting to change it, fighting against the oligarchs who control it. For example, you have Robert F. Kennedy Jr., as people know, who is, whatever you think about his stance on certain issues, is certainly not controlled by the Democratic Party oligarchy. And he's opposed to these foreign wars. He's pro-union, and whatever else you think about some of his other policies. He's independent. He's his own man. And in a lot of ways, he's fighting for the heart and soul of the Democratic Party. But you look at what they're doing to him, right? The controllers of the party. They won't debate him. They're turning him into a non-person. Increasingly, he's being blacked out of the news media. They won't let him in any debates. And he's even been denied Secret Service protection, which is just, I mean, that's enough to impeach Joe Biden right there, frankly. I mean, given the history of the Kennedy family, and given that there was actually, a threat to his life, a potential assassination attempt which occurred against him just a few days ago, the denial of Secret Service protection is absolutely criminal. So, the Democratic, the situation in the Democratic Party is very bad. You have, I'm not going to talk about it at length tonight, but you obviously have the green, the whole Green New Deal and the total embracement of the green agenda within the Democratic Party, beginning with the Biden administration and on down. But it's not just the elected officials. As I said, it's coming from the oligarchy. It's coming from the foundations. It's coming from the moneyed class, who control the elections and who now control, the Democratic Party in terms of these green policies, and this is the reality of it. The truth of the matter is, and this is the challenge to trade unionists and to other working class people within the Democratic Party, is that the proper home for working class people today in 2023, the only place where they can find someone fighting for them, for their interests, is in the Trump movement, is with Donald Trump. If you look at his Agenda 47, what he's put forward there are policies which will create millions upon millions of jobs, policies which will build great projects, policies which will focus on actual production, manufacturing, infrastructure, science, industry, as opposed to financial speculation. This is the movement that Trump is leading. Now, I will make the distinction that this is not a movement that is shared And these are not ideas that are shared by all people within the Republican Party. Certainly not by the Republican Party oligarchs who hate Trump. But it is the movement that Trump is leading. Now, you know, there's a lot I could say about the UAW strike, but what I want to discuss tonight really is Abraham Lincoln. So I'm going to leave the UAW strike. I mean, I'm not going to leave it, but I'm going to shorten what I could say about it. Maybe it will come up more in the discussion. But as I said, the strike began 8 days ago. It's now expanded to 38 plants in 20 states. And one of the things you have to realize, which a lot of people are not aware of, is that this is not a case of the UAW demanding more money, more benefits. These greedy UAW, you got people working at the minimum wage, barely making it, but the UAW wants to get more money just for their members. That's not what's going on at all. Essentially, what the UAW is trying to do is they're fighting tooth and nail to recover what they've lost, what they gave away and what was taken away from them since 2007. In the 2007-2008 financial crisis, at that time, many of the, several of the automakers, GM and others, were threatening bankruptcy back in 2007. They were threatening bankruptcy and they were asking the government for bailouts, and they were saying that they were about to go under. It was like doomsday. And in response to that, they pressured the auto union, the UAW, to make deep concessions, which, under crisis conditions, the UAW agreed to. And this covers a number of things, including reduction in wages, the establishment of what are called wage tiers, where newly hired employees get less than the people already working there, the elimination of cost of living increases, the elimination of traditional pensions, the allowing the companies to hire large numbers of temporary workers, with no benefits and at much lower wages. And the UAW, and there were other things, and the UAW agreed to all this in 2007, 2008. As a result of which, if you look at auto workers today, the average auto worker today makes between 1/2 and 2/3 of what auto workers were making 25 years ago. Between 1/2 and 2/3, if you take inflation into account. So auto workers have suffered, a substantial 25% to 33% reduction in their actual wages during the last 20 to 30 years. And it's gotten much worse since 2007, 2008. So what this strike is about, when the UAW agreed to all of these concessions, which were major concessions in 2007, 2008, this was supposed to be because of an emergency, and it was sort of understood. It was not put in writing, but it was understood that these were temporary emergency measures. But guess what? Here we are 15, 16 years later, and all of these, emergency measures are still in effect. You have these two-tier workers now, who this is what they call the tier system, where they come in, they get hired at a much lower wage. They don't qualify for the same pensions, and there are other things involved as well. They don't qualify for the same healthcare system, the same retirement system, or many of the other benefits. The temporary workers, who are over 10% of the auto workforce, they qualify for almost nothing. And what the UAW is demanding is that what they gave away in 2007, 2008 be restored to them. Now, this would still not bring their wages back to where they were 30 years ago, 20 years ago, but it would be a significant step in the right direction towards, having a workforce which has a decent standard of living. So, this is what's going on. And it's, what we're seeing today is not just restricted to the auto workers. People may not be aware that, more than 300,000 workers have gone out on strike this year. And there are several other large strikes that are looming between now and the end of the year, which could bring, at least a couple of hundred more thousand workers out on strike. This is the strike wave this year is the biggest in quite a long time, not the biggest in history, but quite a long time, because what we have is a desperate population, a desperate workforce, who no longer are able to maintain, a middle-class standard of living or any kind of standard of living. People in unions who can't make their house payments, who can't make their car payments, who can't pay for the medical care their children need, who can't afford to have children. It's all, coming down on people, and people are desperate. And we're seeing this strike wave, spreading around the country. It involves a lot of different kinds of people at this point. There have been strikes in the recent months involving UPS workers, locomotive plant workers, hotel workers, healthcare workers, many individual factories where the workers have gone out on strike, things of this sort, and so this is the kind of environment that we're in. Look, let me just turn to this question of Lincoln. But what I want to do in doing that is I do want to begin with a little short history on this question of trade unions in the United States, which almost nobody, unless you specialize in this field, knows anything about. But essentially, trade unions had no legal recognition in the United States until 1842. There had been efforts to organize them prior to that, because, when you're getting into the 1810s, 1820s, 1830s, you're getting into the development of industry and various kinds of manufacturing and various kinds of crafts. And there had been efforts, serious efforts, to try to organize, workers. Mostly they tried to do it themselves, into negotiating groups where they would negotiate as a body with the, company owner or something like that. And there have been attempts to do this, but all such attempts had been declared illegal. And in fact, and this is the case, there were actually, quite a number of court cases where unions were declared illegal. And the basis for those decisions was English common law. Because there's obviously nothing in the Constitution about trade unions, pro or anti. But the decisions were based on English common law, where what was said was that a trade union was an illegal conspiracy because it involved a group of workers getting together and conspiring against the interests of the owner of the company. And that by conspiring in this way, they were conspiring to hurt the owner, to basically force him to give money to them. So it's almost as a means of coercion, and all, and in case after case, and this was a precedent in English common law. It went back almost 200 years, believe it or not, in English common law, where unions had over and over again been declared illegal conspiracies. But in 1842, a case came before the Supreme Court of Massachusetts, the state Supreme Court of Massachusetts, where it was called Commonwealth versus Hunt, where the Chief Justice and the majority of the judges, Chief Justice Lemuel Shaw and a majority of the judges, rejected the British common law argument and said that, and they ruled that labor combinations, they didn't call them unions, because I guess they weren't even called unions then, but labor combinations were legal, provided that they were organized for a legal purpose and used legal means to achieve their goals. So that was in 1842. And that's really when unions got the right to operate in the open, to operate freely. That was the beginning of it. And that ruling only applied to Massachusetts, but it didn't take long for it to spread to other states around the country. Now, what else was going on in 1842? Well, in 1842, the year of that decision, Abraham Lincoln was just completing his final term as a member of the Illinois state legislature. This was his fourth term, and he was just completing it. From the very beginning, you could go back to that period, and I don't have a quote from 1842, but it is very clear that, from his earliest political activity, and particularly going into the 1850s, Lincoln was extremely supportive of this new labor movement, of the creation of unions and the right of workers to negotiate and strike for better pay and better conditions. In other words, almost from the start of, maybe not the very day, but almost from the start of when unions became legal in 1842, Lincoln was championing the right of unions to be organized and the right of workers to strike. He was a friend of labor right from the beginning. And I'll give you, a couple of quotes from him. In 1860, when he was, I think this was when he was campaigning for the Republican Party nomination for president. It was before the Republican Party convention, but it was after his speech at the Cooper Union. Lincoln did a campaign tour of New England, and he spoke in Boston. This is the spring of 1860. And in his speech, he made note of the organization of trade unions in Massachusetts and Massachusetts's progressive labor laws. And he stated, and this is a direct quote, "I am glad to see that a system of labor prevails in New England under which laborers can strike. I would to God that such a system prevailed all over the world," unquote. And then later that same day, in a private discussion, and this was written down by the person involved, in a private discussion that same day, Lincoln stated, quote, "I know that in almost every case of strikes, the men have just cause for complaint." So that was in 1860. Earlier, 6 years earlier, in 1854, Lincoln had given a speech to the Illinois Working Man's Association on the subject of free labor. Now, this also involves slavery and what have you. But in that speech, he emphasized the right of labor, the right of working men to have decent wages, working conditions, and opportunities for advancement. Right? And you have to sort of bear in mind, a couple of things. I mean, one is that during his youth, Lincoln had, spent years upon years upon years of hard physical labor. I mean, he was essentially, for quite a period of time in his youth, he was, more or less an indentured servant, who was sent out by his father to do these jobs and what have you. And he did, for any people who know anything about Lincoln's biography, he toiled in many, many difficult types of occupations. And, he was no stranger to hard labor. And he also was very aware, personally, from his own experience, the advantage taken over laborers by the bosses, by the employers, the exploitation of labor. Lincoln knew this through his own personal experience. So what you have in Lincoln is a very, very interesting combination. And I think it is of great relevance to today. Because, when Lincoln was in the Illinois legislature, he became the champion of something called the Illinois system, where they built hundreds and hundreds of miles of railroads, hundreds and hundreds of miles of canals, other kinds of infrastructure. He was focused on the larger economic development of the state of Illinois. And then later, of course, the same thing as president. Also, when he was a lawyer, he represented some of the largest, as a lawyer, he represented some of the largest railroads in the United States. He represented large corporations. Lincoln was not against corporations. He was not against, big economic development projects. But it was Lincoln. But Lincoln was also, deeply committed to the interests of working people, working men and women, working families. This gets to Lincoln's notion, really, of what the American Republic is all about. Because, in many places, not just here and there, but if you read Lincoln's writings and other things in his speeches, he states over and over and over again that one of the most fundamental principles of the American Republic, one of the most fundamental lessons that can be drawn from the Declaration of Independence, is what he called the right to rise, or the right to advance. That fundamentally, that the Declaration of Independence contained a promise of the right to advance, the right to improve one's condition for all of the people, not a select group of people, not, an oligarchy, but for all of the people. And, and he called this the right to advance materially, morally, and intellectually. And I'll read you just a one sentence or a two sentence quote from Lincoln in 1854, where he says, quote, advancement, the improvement in condition, is the order of things in a society of equals. The power of hope upon human exertion and happiness is wonderful. The power of hope upon human exertion and happiness is wonderful. So this was how he thought about America. Hope for the future, hope for advancement, hope for a new, better society. That this is where happiness, is found. And I'll read you another quote. This is a little bit longer. It's one paragraph. This is from Lincoln's, the last of the Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1858, October 15th, 1858. And it's an excerpt from what Lincoln said at that time. He says, "The issue that will continue in this country when these poor tongues of Judge Douglas and myself shall be silent, it is the eternal struggle between these two principles, right and wrong, throughout the world. They are the two principles that have stood face to face from the beginning of time and will continue to struggle into the future. The one is the common right of humanity, and the other the divine right of kings. It is the same principle in whatever shape it develops itself. It is the same spirit that says, you work and toil and earn bread, and I'll eat it. No matter in what shape it comes, whether from the mouth of a king who seeks to bestride the people of his own nation and live by the fruit of their labor, or from one race of men as an apology for enslaving another race, it is the same tyrannical principle." So, for Lincoln, obstructing or preventing the right of the people to advance, the extinguishing of the hope of advancement, was the essence of tyranny, right? And now, look, there's another issue which is related to this in a very profound way, and I'm not going to be able to go into it in a great deal of depth, but it is also the question of Lincoln's views on education. In 1832, when he's fairly young, Lincoln gave a speech in which his primary focus was on education. And he said, quote, "Upon the subject of education, not presuming to dictate any plan or system respecting it, I can only say that I view it as the most important subject which we as a people can be engaged in, that every man may receive at least a moderate education, and thereby be enabled to read the histories of his own and other countries, by which he may duly appreciate the value of our free institution, appears to me to be an object of vital importance." Now, there's a lot more that I could say about this, but this question of education, remained as a primary focus of Lincoln's mission in life until the day he died. And you can look at just two things he did while he was president. One was the creation of the land grant colleges, which he considered, and he states this in letters that he wrote, he considered the creation of the land grant colleges to be one of the greatest accomplishments of his life. And then second was the question of the Freedmen's Bureau for education for the freed Black slaves. See, because, Lincoln, who taught himself, who was self-taught, who went from being completely illiterate to being a profound student of Shakespeare. Lincoln understood the wonder and the power of the human mind and the creative potential of the human mind. And he knew that education was absolutely vital to, unleashing the potentials that exist within, each citizen, crucial to the advancement of the people. This is what Lincoln is always thinking about: creating a society, of advancement, of discoveries, of investigations into scientific problems, making great art and drama accessible to people, and this goes hand in hand with his support for trade unions, his support for working people. And it also goes hand in hand with, the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, and the great, scientific and industrial progress that was made under the Lincoln's presidency. It's a non-oligarchical society. And in that regard, I do want to mention, and I'm running a little over here. I'm going to try to cut it short. I do want to mention something because I think it's relevant, even though it's very tangential to this, but I want to mention it anyway, which is because it's connected. Really, it is connected. I want to mention the Knights of Labor and a man named Terence Powderly, who was the head of the Knights of Labor. Now, a lot of people today don't know anything about the Knights of Labor, but they were really the first major nationwide trade union. They weren't the first. There was something earlier, called the National Labor Union, which only existed for a few years. But beginning in the 1870s, the Knights of Labor emerged as a national trade union movement. And by the 1880s, it had hundreds and hundreds of thousands of members, carried out numerous strikes. The person who headed it up was a man named Terence Powderly, who was a teenager, a young teenager, too young to serve, during the Civil War. But he idolized Abraham Lincoln. During the Civil War, he posted a flag with a hammer and nail on the roof of his barn, an American flag, and he hung it there throughout the war. And he actually had to replace it a couple of times because the flag got all torn up and tattered. So he put up a new one. But it was there for the duration of the war, and he maintained it, to show his commitment to the Union war effort and to the Lincoln presidency. And he idolized Lincoln. After the war, after Lincoln's assassination, when he became a young adult, he became a leader and a champion to defend Lincoln's greenback policy and to try to keep the greenbacks in circulation. He was a strong supporter of the greenback policy, which is an understatement. He actually ran for office several times and got elected mayor of Scranton, Pennsylvania 3 times on the greenback labor ticket. And then later on, in the 1890s, he became a strong supporter of William McKinley, and he campaigned all across the United States in 1896 in support of McKinley's campaign for the presidency against William Jennings Bryan. And at that time, the Knights of Labor had sort of seriously declined. It was in the process of disappearing. And you had other unions coming into creation, and some of them were supporting William Jennings Bryan, the populist. And Powderly toured the United States and gave hundreds of speeches in 1896, the vast majority of which were to union meetings. And he went into union meeting after union meeting after union meeting telling them that they should support McKinley for the presidency. And he was a big backer of McKinley's protective tariffs, of the high tariffs. Now, why do I bring this up other than the fact that, here's Powderly, who's the, head of the biggest union in the United States, who's also a big supporter of Abraham Lincoln. Well, one of the reasons I bring it up is because, the Powderly, despite the fact that the Knights of Labor were very militant and they did lead a lot of strikes, Powderly was actually opposed to strikes because, what he said, and he said this explicitly many times, is that what was required to move the country forward was what he called an alliance of producers. He said that the business owners, had common cause with the working men, that they could, negotiate and dispute about wage levels and this, that, and the other thing, but that fundamentally they had a common cause, a common principle, which was the upward development of the nation. And he contrasted this to what he called the parasites and the speculators. So it's very interesting, frankly. And, one of the things that the Knights of Labor did, and this was a big part of the Knights of Labor, it wasn't some little side thing, is they had an enormous amount of social activity for their members all across the country. Picnics, luncheons, this, that, lectures. They have guest lecturers come in, educationals. And it wasn't just all, let's play football and all that. They had speakers and what have you. And the way Powderly talked about it is, he says, what our intention is to create a Republican culture in the United States. That's Republican with a small r, a Republican culture in which our members, learn the principles and the meaning of what it means to be an American, right? And and this was how he looked at things in terms of, an alliance of producers for the development of the nation, right? Now, so look, to sort of wrap this up, I mean, there's obviously a lot more I could say, but one point I do want to make, which I also made last Saturday, for any sort of self-satisfied Republicans out there who say, well, yeah, we all know how bad the Democratic Party is. The auto workers and the blacks should all come over and join Trump. What we're talking about here is, is something new, because look, you get people who are lifelong Republicans. Maybe some of you are lifelong Republicans. I'm a lifelong Republican and I'm proud of it. Well, what the hell do you have to be proud of? Did you vote for George Bush Sr.? Did you vote for George Bush Jr.? Did you vote for John McCain, who hated Donald Trump? Did you vote for Mitt Romney, who hates Donald Trump? What is there to be proud of? As I went through last week in terms of the foundations, the Koch brothers, the rest of these people, these are the people who have controlled the Republican Party. And unfortunately, you still have many, quote unquote, conservative Republicans who support the agenda of these Republican billionaires. Let's get rid of the minimum wage. Let's get rid of Social Security. Let's get rid of, Medicare, Medi-Cal. Let's get rid of all these things. Let's have let's have an open shop and get rid of the trade unions. That's the policy of the Koch brothers. That's the policy of, these free trade Republicans. Look, when NAFTA was passed, when they adopted these policies that turned our entire economy into a gambling casino, as Terence Powderly said, financial speculators and parasites, hedge funds, and all of this, when they, shipped all of our jobs overseas to China, Mexico, Vietnam, and everywhere else in the world you can imagine, and shut down all of the productive economies, when they created hellholes in these former cities that used to be manufacturing cities and brought the drugs in, the cocaine, the heroin, the fentanyl. The billionaires in both parties did this. The billionaires in both parties did this. Look, if you're going to say today that we need to bring, blacks and Republicans and Hispanics into the Trump movement, and that is exactly what we have to do, not just for the election, but for the future of the country, to create a new majority in this country. But if we're going to bring trade unionists, blacks, and Hispanics into the Trump movement, then a lot of Republicans are going to have to get over, their anti-union sentiments, and a lot of them are going to have to deal with the reality of what life is like for people making under, these people in the inner cities making under, $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 a year. These are, poor people. And let me put it a slightly different way. People in the Trump movement, and by that I don't mean Trump, because I know how big of a heart Trump has. But people in the Trump movement need to have a big heart, because what we're talking about here is a big tent, political tent, big enough to hold everyone except the speculators, oligarchs, and parasites. But it's big enough for the rest of us. But that means we have to have policies which are going to benefit and uplift all of us, and that's the fight. That's the fight right now. And, the unionists have their own problem, which is that the UAW workers who are out on strike now, many of whom are pro-Trump, and many of the other blue-collar workers around the country who are pro-Trump, they've got a problem with their union leadership. So, that's a fight they have to wage, because really, what's the point of fighting over wages, if you're an auto worker, if Biden's Green New Deal is going to shut down the entire auto industry? You're going to redistribute the wealth when there's no wealth left there to redistribute. We need an economic revolution in this country. We need to end rule by the speculator class, and we have to have policies which are, which give every American the opportunity to advance, to be productive, to have hope for the future. And that's really what Lincoln did. Lincoln is an extraordinary president. And what he did is really, in many ways, the model, the paradigm for how people should be thinking about the MAGA movement today. I don't know. It's 5:00, so I really can't go any longer. So I left a lot out, but let's open it up, folks. Okay.